Hello, I'm Toycat, and do you like bad maps? Because if so, here's 16 of them, starting with the average annual temperature per capita. I love this because per capita is meant to be the great equalizer, but when you do it to temperature, you get one of the messiest maps in the world, and as you can see, the coldest country per capita is China, but also here is a map of the states of Mexico based on whether or not they have a state flag. Most do not, some have a fairly boring one, like these blue ones, and 2 states, including where my editor from, intriguingly enough, actually can explicitly not have a state flag, and then there's one really awesome flag right here at the very bottom of the country. I think it's a great flag personally. What do you think though? I also think that this is a really interesting map because when we talk about the Chagos Islands, when we talk about the British Indian Overseas Territory, we talk about the loss of it as being something that is, you know, at best neutral, but at worst a bad thing for the UK, right? We are now giving away land that we're having to lease back. However, 2,000 Britons, people from the UK, were asked, please use this map to indicate where you think the Chagos Islands are located according to the best of your knowledge, and I've got to say, I'm impressed that there is even a hotspot in the right area. You know, I've got to admit, I would probably be somewhere in this loose space, but what I'm amazed by is how random some of these spacings are. Well, first of all, some people seem to think Scotland are the Chagos Islands, and I've got to admit, that's kind of nuts. I think the Caribbean guesses are kind of interesting too, but the most shocking of all are people who seem to place pins in the middle of Russia or China. I mean, how can you possibly think that the Chagos Islands are somewhere in Brazil? It's literally called islands. You've got to be able to know that Brazil isn't an island at some point, right? But maybe you don't, and that's why it's a bad map. Speaking of bad maps, let's talk about this one. This is a very common mistake that you might see, where China just gets to annex some of its random neighbors. I wonder if people who do this, because it comes up a fair often, this is just one such example, I wonder if people who are doing this are secretly saying, yeah, Tajikistan doesn't really need to exist. China could just annex you. And honestly, I wonder if from China's perspective, if they think they could just annex Tajikistan, and they just genuinely don't think it's worth the time. What do you think, geopolitics experts of the internet? Speaking of being an expert on the internet, let's talk about date formats in each country. This is a map which on the surface seemed pretty rational, like, oh yeah, it's there to point out that America, and indeed sometimes Canada, are the only countries to do that weird system where the month comes first, and then the day, and then the year. How do you make that up? The only defense I've ever seen of it is that, oh yeah, well, we call it July 4th. And it's like, no, you call it the 4th of July. You know, like, literally, you don't even say your dates the way you write them. It's insanity for the sake of insanity. And then my second thought was, oh yeah, Mongolia and China, they have a very logical system of year, month, day. But then I started thinking, wait a minute, and you know, like, the UK isn't listed as day, month, year. We're listed as day, month, year plus year, month, day. But even though I think year, month, day is much better, I've never really seen it used anywhere except for file systems. And then I realized, it's a bad map. It got me. It got me real good apparently. And speaking of being gotten real good, here is a map of country parts of Spain that really like being part of Spain. Indeed, the parts of Spain that are proud to be Spanish. And then there are the parts of Spain that find being part of Spain very Spainful. And you know, it's the worst joke, but it's kind of true, right? I feel like Spain is a country above almost any other, where significant portions from different parts of the country in all sorts of different ways find it absolutely awful to be a part of Spain. And you know, really, there's so many separatist movements. Indeed, you know, the Madrid train bombings and all of these crazy terror movements in Europe used to come from Spain, and so I guess we should give them some credit for not having that anymore. But also, isn't it nuts that it exists as a country with a very clear hole in it that doesn't want to be part of Spain, and then even the parts that do get to be part of Spain also don't really like being part of it? Okay, that's a point for another time. Here's a list of countries and their independence. I don't know why it's spelt so bizarrely like that way. Maybe that's why this is such a bad map. I think this is an interesting map to show because, as you can see, there are only some countries that have existed fully independent consistently since before 1776. And also, you can tell this map was done by an American by using 1776 as the important date to set things off. I think Haiti's revolution is perhaps a more notable one in terms of countries actually deciding to go their own way. But anyway, you can see that, yeah, there are a whole bunch of different countries, with the majority in Africa going independent somewhere in the 1960s, which I guess is kind of interesting. Speaking of things that are kind of interesting, I just want to see my steak looks like Greenland. I want to talk about this because I get angry how commonly this gets posted on the internet, and the only reason why is because I had when I first went to the United States, I went out to a steakhouse. You know, it was a fun thing I wanted to do, and I showed a picture of my steak to my German girlfriend, and she was like, the steak looks like Germany, and I was like, no, it doesn't. The steak looks like a steak, and Germany looks like Germany, and you know, as someone who's into maps, you'd figure I'd be all over that, but it's like, no, this looks nothing like Greenland. This is just what a steak looks like. I think Greenland might look slightly like a steak you could could be able to say. And in that same way, I guess you could argue that Germany sort of looks like a steak. Speaking of steak, there's lots of steaks when it comes to not just the Chagos Islands, but also to Europe more broadly, because here's a map of Europe during Eurovision. I love this map for lots of different reasons. As you can see, there's the fun for, you know, like Israel and Cyprus get fully involved in Europe at this point in time. Also, as you can see, like, oh yeah, there's just Australia hanging out over there. Isn't that very fun? The Bay of Biscay is now the Bay of Australia. Honestly, I think the world would be a lot better if we moved Australia from its super isolated spot right here into Europe. All those, you know, all those deals they have to do with, you know, like China, all those, you know, like all those natural resources they have to ship so far, they could just ship them in a lorry over to France. And I'm just saying, you know, actually, if we're going to send the coal somewhere, like France makes sense. But maybe they could ship the more valuable things to other countries too. I'm just saying, this is a great map of Europe, and it shows that Eurovision is one of the most illogical groupings of countries. You know, the fact that Eurovision has Euro in the name is very confusing on its own right. But speaking of things that are confusing on their own right, let's go now into a map of Australia, but as measured by the country which they're closest to. I've always enjoyed these for other places in the world, but I found this fascinating for Australia because there's almost like an ACT size area over here for Timor-Leste. Then it's Indonesia for most of Australia, Papua New Guinea for a little bit over here. And then there is a part of Australia, a significant part where the majority of the population lives, that are closest to France. Did you know that? This image right here was meant to be a joke, right? But as you can see, genuinely, Australia is closest to France, and this part of Australia would then be bordering France. I'm just saying, it's a match made in heaven. Anyone at the UN, if you're watching this video and you're looking for great ideas, one, you know, consider handing some islands in the North Arctic Ocean over to the UK. You know, I could do with a little bit of benefit for this. That's the only payment I need, I guess. But two, if you could so kindly consider, please let's look into putting some like jetpacks or some boosters on the side of Australia. Let's get it moved over here. You know, if we can mail over millions of pointless cables and bricks and stuff around the world, we should be able to mail in Australia by this point, right? Don't you think? Speaking of things we should be able to mail, here is a mail map of Australasia, and it's mail because it's protruding from underneath the surface. More seriously, this is a map of New Zealandia. You know, it's a continent that exists, but it's a continent that exists. But it would be Zealandia would be considered a continent if it all wasn't submerged, but most of it is underwater. Here's what it looked like if it wasn't. As you can see, New Zealand would be so ugly, and we wouldn't love it anywhere near as much, and therefore we wouldn't care that it was a continent. But you know, gotta admire the desire to have it anyway. Speaking of desire, here's a fun map of education infographics, and they say they found it on a suitcase cover, but I have so many questions about it. One is the fact that they call, you know, as you can see, there's like it's kind of dividing the world up into continents, but then Canada and the United States and Alaska and South America are the way they divide this up here. Kind of confusing to show Alaska separately, although personally, kind of like that. And then we've got Europe, Russia, Africa, Asia, and Australia. And again, I instinctively want to say, how do you decide that these things should be done, right? How do you think that Asia is a continent that stops at a perfectly straight line? And then also, if you look closer, you can see it says lorem ipsum under all of these. There's not even any definitions. And then I think, you know, actually, Asia is too big. Rather than making a point about how India is basically a subcontinent, instead, isn't it a more fun point to say, yeah, Russia and the Middle East have a lot in common because they're the oil countries. And so really, if we're going to have a buffer between Europe, Africa, and Asia, it should be the oil countries. I mean, that's how it works on international flights. Why shouldn't it be how it works for the way we divide the world? Speaking of the way we divide the world, here is a map of Eastern Europe in 1939 from a history book. And honestly, this is one that gets ragged on a lot from the internet. You know, some poor history person out there decided to draw this. But I think that the crazy thing about this map is probably the fact that it's so good at getting under the radar. The fact, you know, Czechoslovakia, everyone knows that Hitler decided to, that bad man, I should say, he decided to invade the Sudetenland and then eventually all of Czechoslovakia, right? But you might think to yourself, well, he probably got Czechia, but I know that Slovakia was a communist country, and like, if obviously if the USSR got half of Poland, surely they'd be taking half of Czechoslovakia too. It's such a tiny, you know, it's so illogical if you know the story, but I actually kind of see this. Although I would then say, if you look at this map, why would you assume the USSR got all of this, but not this stretch of Poland. Also, can we just always give a little F in chat for Poland, always getting partitioned by its rude neighbors? If if you ever spot a paranoid Polish person, it's like, you're right to be that way. Apparently the world just decides you don't get to exist every 50, 60 years. Speaking of not getting to exist, Japan. Here is Japan, and I love this map of the United States of Japan, because it just feels so accurate. I mean, obviously Hawaii being the islands that are far away from the mainland, that makes sense. Japan basically has its own Hawaii, and fascinating enough, in the same way that Hawaii is a lot more Japanese than the mainland US, I would say that Okinawa is much more American than mainland Japan. Someone found this so funny recently, but I went to, I've only ever been to Red Lobster once, and it was in Okinawa. It was not very good. They did not give me a lobster roll. Would not go back. But yeah, apparently they have a lot of American chains there they don't have elsewhere because of all the Americans, and also they're super car dependent there, which everyone knows America loves that stuff. But here's Alaska, as you can see. Then there's Minnesota in the kind of cold north that's not quite separated, New Hampshire, Maine, etc. And then there's the warm states down here. I'm just saying this all makes a lot of sense. I haven't checked that all the states are there, and I'll be honest with you, it would take me a long time to do so. The only one I disagree with is this being California. I feel like California would probably be Osaka, right? Like the weird city that's got a flex about being different. And I also would say Virginia being Kyoto, or this area being Kyoto, also doesn't fit right with me. But yeah, New York being Tokyo, New Jersey being the greater Tokyo area, it's all very genius otherwise, and the United States of Japan are great, almost as great as the counties in California I've visited. I don't know why I'm showing you this map, but the point is that someone walked into him pooping in a Raising Cane's restroom on October 3rd, 2024, and apparently he hasn't gotten over that. It is actually a cool idea of like counties that you've been to. You know, I'm always showing off my Jetpunk map, which by the way, fun little update, as you'll all know, I just went to a new country, and I can add it to my map. But, you know, I'm always showing off the Jetpunk map of countries. But there is a weird point of like, you know, you can say you've been to all these countries, right? 53 countries now. Look, it's exciting. I've got this peninsula fully covered, but have I really been to all of these islands in Indonesia? Have I been to Sarawak and Sabah, you know? The answer is obviously no, but that's why countries are kind of weird. I guess the same point is then true for counties too, but it's funny that you can be from a state, you know, from a state that is one that people travel across a lot and still have not gone to well over half of the counties inside of it. Maybe that's not interesting, actually. What you might find more interesting is Europe if it was colonized by Europe. It's such a good map. I love this so much. Because, you know, it is true. When you look at the United States, it's a very square continent. But the weird bit, in my opinion, is that the Europeans aren't the ones drawing the square borders. It was the Americans who had territory that they're like, oh, we need to turn this into governable states. We'll draw a square, I guess. And so this would be really Europe if it were colonized by American presidents who are looking to vastly expand the size of the United States against the will of its in existing states. But still, the point is, I love this map regardless. I feel like, honestly, the only issue I have with it is that these squares aren't quite aligned with each other enough. I like that there's the random panhandles here or there, but yeah, Europe, it was colonized by Europe. Not quite memeing enough. If someone can do a better job of that, I'd love to see. But you know what else I'd love to see? Something that I already have seen. That's right, this map of the world in about 260 million years. It might be billion. I'll be honest, it's fun to look at because they, you know, taking the way that the world's going to look and applying modern borders to it partially tells you about, you know, like the fact that obviously, you know, if you think modern borders aren't going to change, got some bad news for you. But it also says like, oh my god, the world is going to be such a mess. Let's zoom in real quick into like England over here. Why, apparently Scotland's going to float off, you know, they've been wanting to do that for a while. England's gonna hit into France and probably make a mountain range over here. London and Paris are gonna get a little bit closer. I can't imagine, is the Eurostar still gonna work if there's no ocean for it to tunnel through? But you're gonna see that there's gonna be all sorts of wild things in the world. Look at China. Actually, you know, China's position basically doesn't change. They get a lot closer to, you know, they start spooning Korea a lot more than they were before, and then there's some yellow lakes that get formed, which feels offensive, but the point here is that Australia still doesn't end up next to France, which is the great injustice. This is the Europe we deserve, and the moment someone offers to bring it to me is the moment that I would say I'm happy. But speaking of ways I'm happy, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, consider supporting the channel on Patreon, and otherwise, I'll see you in the next one, unless I don't. Goodbye. Oh, wait, yeah, I make videos twice a week on this channel now. I've gone into a vague upload schedule that I've kept for a whole 2 weeks in a row. And if you want to see that upload schedule continue, then consider subscribing or becoming a Patreon. It encourages me to spend more of my valuable, limited time on this earth on this channel. Is that how subscriber pitches are meant to work? I probably nailed it. Seriously though, if you're at the UN, we could make this work. All I need is just give me one of these islands. One of these islands, and I will do the marketing for Australia and Europe. Make it happen.